The letter arrived at Muhammad Ali's training camp in Deer Lake, Pennsylvania, on a Tuesday morning in 1975. His trainer, Angelo Dundee, found it slipped under the door of the main cabin, the envelope bearing no return address, but postmarked from Birmingham, Alabama. "Muhammad," Dundee called out, holding the letter uncertainly. "You got mail, but it don't look like fan mail." Ali was hitting the heavy bag, sweat pouring down his face as he worked through combinations. The thriller in Manila was just weeks away, and every punch carried the weight of his rivalry with Joe Frazier. "Read it to me," Ali said between punches. "I got work to do." Dundee opened the envelope carefully, his face darkening as he scanned the contents. "Maybe I should just throw this away, Muhammad." Ali stopped punching and turned around. "What's it say?" It's not good. It's from some preacher down south. Says some ugly things." Ali walked over and took the letter from Dundee's hands. His eyes moved across the page, taking in words that had been written with obvious hatred and contempt. The letter was from Reverend Thomas Mitchell, pastor of First Baptist Church of Birmingham, a man who had built his reputation on fiery sermons about racial purity and the dangers of mixing religion with what he called foreign influences. "Dear Mr. Clay," the letter began, deliberately using Ali's birth name, "I have watched your career with growing disgust and concern. You have abandoned the Christian faith of your fathers for a heathen religion that preaches hatred against white people. You have refused to serve your country in its time of need. You have disgraced yourself and your race with your arrogance and your blasphemy." Ali continued reading, his expression growing more serious with each line. "You think you can win in the boxing ring, but you cannot win in matters of faith. You have chosen the wrong God, and you will pay the price for your apostasy. When you face Joe Frazier in Manila, remember that God does not protect those who have turned their backs on him. I will be praying for your defeat and your humiliation." The letter was signed with a flourish, "Reverend Thomas Mitchell, servant of the true God." Ali folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket. Dundee watched him nervously, expecting an explosion of anger or at least some sharp words. Instead, Ali was quiet for a long moment. "Angelo," he said finally, "get me some paper and a pen. Muhammad, don't let this fool get under your skin. He's just trying to mess with your head before the fight." "I'm not angry," Ali said, surprising his trainer. "I'm sad for him." Ali sat down at the small desk in the corner of the cabin and began to write. His handwriting was careful and deliberate, each word chosen with the same precision he used to place his punches. "Dear Reverend Mitchell," he began, "I received your letter today, and I want to thank you for taking the time to write to me. I know it must have been difficult for you to put your feelings into words." Dundee read over Ali's shoulder, shaking his head. "Muhammad, what are you doing? This man just wished for your defeat. He called you a blasphemer." "He's hurting, Angelo. Hurt people, but love can heal hurt." Ali continued writing. "Reverend Mitchell, I want you to know that I don't hate you for what you wrote. I understand that you believe you are defending your faith, and I respect that kind of devotion, even when I disagree with your conclusions." The letter continued for several pages, Ali's words flowing with a gentleness that seemed impossible given the venom he was responding to. "You say, I cannot win in matters of faith, and maybe you're right. But I'm not trying to win anything. I'm trying to live according to what I believe is true. I converted to Islam, not because I hate Christianity, but because I found a path that spoke to my heart and my conscience." Ali paused in his writing, thinking about his own journey from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali, about the night he had first heard Elijah Muhammad speak, about the way the words had resonated in his soul like nothing he had ever heard before. "You mention my refusal to serve in Vietnam, and you call it cowardice. But, Reverend, I gave up 3.5 years of my career, millions of dollars, and the prime of my athletic life because I believed it was wrong to kill people who had never done anything to me. If that's cowardice, then I'm proud to be a coward." Dundee was pacing now, worried about the effect this correspondence might have on Ali's preparation for the biggest fight of his career. "Mohammed, you don't owe this man anything. He's trying to get in your head." Maybe he is," Ali said without looking up from his writing, "but maybe God is using him to teach me something about forgiveness." Ali continued writing, his words becoming more personal and vulnerable. "Reverend Mitchell, I want to tell you something that might surprise you. I pray for people like you every day. I pray for people who hate me because of my religion, my race, or my beliefs. I pray that God will soften their hearts and help them see that we are all His children, regardless of what we call Him or how we choose to worship Him." The letter went on to describe Ali's own understanding of faith, his belief that God was bigger than any one religion, his conviction that love was the highest commandment, regardless of which holy book you read. "You say that God will not protect me in my fight with Joe Frazier because I have turned my back on him. But Reverend, what if you're wrong? What if God cares more about how we treat each other than about which building we worship in? What if He judges us by our compassion rather than our creeds?" Ali finished the letter with an invitation that stunned Dundee. "Reverend Mitchell, I would like to invite you to come to Manila to watch my fight with Joe Frazier. I will arrange for your travel and accommodations. I want you to see for yourself whether God abandons those who seek Him with sincere hearts, even if they seek Him in ways you don't understand." He signed the letter, "Your brother in faith, Muhammad Ali," and sealed it in an envelope. "Muhammad," Dundee said, "you can't be serious about inviting this man to the fight. He wants to see you get hurt." "That's exactly why I want him there," Ali replied. "Sometimes the only way to change a heart is to show it something it's never seen before." Ali mailed the letter that afternoon, and then put it out of his mind as he focused on his preparation for Manila. The training was brutal, the sparring sessions intense, the weight of expectation enormous. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived from Birmingham. This time, Reverend Mitchell's handwriting was less steady, his words less certain. "Mr. Ali," the letter began, and Ali noticed immediately that the Reverend had used his chosen name this time. "I received your letter, and I must admit it was not what I expected. I have spent considerable time in prayer since reading your words, and I find myself confused." The letter went on to describe Mitchell's struggle with Ali's response. He had expected anger, defensiveness, perhaps even threats. Instead, he had received kindness, understanding, and an invitation that had shaken him to his core. "I have built my ministry on the certainty of my beliefs, on the conviction that I know God's will and can speak for Him. But your letter has made me wonder if perhaps I have been speaking more for my own fears and prejudices than for the Almighty." Mitchell wrote that he had decided to accept Ali's invitation to Manila, not because he wanted to see Ali lose, but because he needed to understand how someone he had been taught to see as an enemy could respond to hatred with such grace. "I am coming to the Philippines not as your enemy, but as a man who is beginning to question everything he thought he knew about faith and forgiveness." When Ali read this second letter, he smiled for the first time in weeks. The pressure of the upcoming fight had been weighing on him, the knowledge that his rivalry with Frazier had reached a point where both men might be permanently damaged by their encounter. "Angelo," he said, "sometimes God works in mysterious ways." The flight to Manila was long and uncomfortable for Reverend Mitchell. He had never traveled outside the United States, had never been surrounded by so many people who didn't look like him or speak his language. But more than that, he was wrestling with doubts that had been growing since he received Ali's letter. He thought about his own ministry, about the sermons he had preached about racial separation and religious purity. He thought about the young people in his congregation who had stopped coming to church, who had told him his message felt more like hate than love. When he arrived in Manila, Mitchell was met at the airport by one of Ali's representatives, a young Muslim man named Hassan, who treated the Reverend with courtesy and respect despite knowing about the letter he had written. "Mr. Ali wanted to make sure you were comfortable," Hassan explained as they drove through the chaotic streets of Manila. "He's arranged for you to stay at the same hotel as his family and friends." Mitchell was surprised by this gesture. He had expected to be isolated, perhaps even humiliated. Instead, he was being treated like an honored guest. That evening, Ali invited Mitchell to dinner with his entourage. The Reverend sat uncomfortably at the table, surrounded by people he had been taught to fear and distrust. But as the evening progressed, he found himself drawn into conversations about faith, family, and the search for meaning that transcended religious boundaries. "Reverend," Ali said during a quiet moment, "I want you to know that having you here means a lot to me. It takes courage to travel this far to see if your beliefs can stand up to reality." Mitchell looked around the table at the faces surrounding him. Muslims, Christians, people of different races and backgrounds, all united in their support for Ali. "Mr. Ali," he said slowly, "I came here expecting to see the devil himself. Instead, I see a man who treats his enemies better than I treat my friends. The fight itself was everything the world expected and more." Mitchell sat ringside, watching as Ali and Fraser beat each other with a ferocity that was both beautiful and terrible. He saw Ali's courage, his refusal to quit even when his body was screaming for mercy. But more than that, he saw something in Ali's eyes during the brief moments between rounds when their gazes met. There was no hatred there, no malice toward the man who was trying to destroy him. There was only determination and a kind of peace that Mitchell had never seen in the eyes of a man engaged in violence. When the fight ended with Fraser unable to continue, Mitchell watched as Ali collapsed in his corner, too exhausted to celebrate. The Reverend found himself crying, though he couldn't say exactly why. After the fight, Mitchell was invited to Ali's dressing room. The champion was battered and exhausted, his face swollen beyond recognition, but he still managed to smile when he saw the Reverend. "What did you think?" Ali asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mitchell struggled to find words. "I thought I would see God punish you for your apostasy. Instead, I saw a man who fought with honor and courage, who showed mercy to his opponent even in victory." Ali nodded slowly. "God doesn't punish people for seeking him, Reverend. He punishes people for refusing to love each other." That night, Mitchell sat in his hotel room and wrote a letter to his congregation back in Birmingham. It was the hardest letter he had ever written, because it required him to admit that everything he had been teaching them might be wrong. "My dear congregation," he began, "I am writing to you from Manila, where I have just witnessed something that has shaken my faith to its foundations. Not shaken my faith in God, but shaken my faith in my own understanding of God's will." He went on to describe his encounter with Ali, the kindness he had been shown, the grace he had witnessed even in the midst of brutal competition. "I came here believing that Muhammad Ali was an enemy of our faith, a man who had turned his back on God and would be punished for his apostasy. Instead, I found a man who lives his faith more authentically than many of us who claim to know the truth." The letter continued for several pages, Mitchell's words becoming more honest and vulnerable with each paragraph. "I have spent years preaching about the dangers of false religions and foreign influences, but I have seen more genuine faith in Muhammad Ali's treatment of his enemies than I have seen in my own treatment of my neighbors." Mitchell concluded the letter with an announcement that would shock his congregation and cost him his position as pastor. "When I return to Birmingham, I will be resigning my position as your pastor. I can no longer preach a message of division and hatred when I have seen the power of love and forgiveness demonstrated so clearly. I need time to learn what it really means to follow God's will. The letter was published in the Birmingham newspaper, creating a scandal that reverberated throughout the religious community in Alabama. Some called Mitchell a traitor, others a fool. But a few, particularly among the younger members of his former congregation, saw his confession as an act of courage. Mitchell returned to Birmingham, a changed man. He sold his large house and moved into a small apartment in a predominantly black neighborhood. He began volunteering at a soup kitchen, working alongside people he had once preached against. 6 months after Manila, Mitchell received a phone call that surprised him. It was Ali, calling to check on how he was doing. "Reverend," Ali said, "I heard about what happened with your church. I'm sorry you lost your position." "Don't be sorry," Mitchell replied. "Losing that position was the best thing that ever happened to me. I was preaching a lie, and God used you to show me the truth." "What truth is that?" Mitchell thought for a moment before answering. "That faith isn't about being right. It's about being loving. And you can't be loving if you're spending all your time trying to prove that other people are wrong." Ali was quiet for a moment. "Reverend, would you like to come visit me sometime? I'd like to continue our conversation." Over the following years, Mitchell became a regular visitor to Ali's home. They would sit for hours discussing theology, philosophy, and the nature of faith. Mitchell learned about Islam not as an enemy religion to be defeated, but as another path toward the same divine truth he was seeking. "You know what I've learned?" Mitchell told Ali during one of their conversations. "I've learned that God is bigger than any of our religions. We're all just trying to touch different parts of the same elephant." Ali smiled. "That's what I tried to tell you in my letter. You can win in the ring, but not in faith. Faith isn't about winning. It's about surrendering." Mitchell's transformation had ripple effects throughout Birmingham and beyond. Young people who had left the church because of its message of hatred began to return, drawn by stories of the pastor who'd been humble enough to admit he was wrong. Other ministers began to question their own teachings about race and religion. Some invited Muslim speakers to their churches. Others began interfaith dialogue groups. The change was slow, but it was real. 5 years after Manila, Mitchell started a new kind of ministry. Instead of preaching from a pulpit, he worked in the community, helping to build bridges between different racial and religious groups. His congregation was small but diverse, united not by shared doctrine, but by shared commitment to love and service. "I used to think my job was to defend God," Mitchell told a reporter who was writing about his transformation. "Now I know my job is to love people the way God loves them. And God loves everybody, even the people I used to think were his enemies." When Ali's Parkinson's disease began to progress, Mitchell was one of his most faithful visitors. He would sit by Ali's bedside, reading to him from both the Bible and the Quran, marveling at how similar the messages of love and compassion were across both traditions. "Muhammad," Mitchell said during one of these visits, "I want to thank you for saving my soul." Ali looked at him with eyes that were still bright despite his physical decline. "I didn't save your soul, Reverend. God did. I was just the messenger. But you could have responded to my hatred with hatred. You could have dismissed me as just another racist preacher. Instead, you showed me what real faith looks like." Ali smiled weakly. "Real faith means loving people who hate you. Real faith means praying for people who curse you. Real faith means believing that God's love is bigger than human prejudice." Mitchell nodded, tears in his eyes. "I spent so many years trying to win arguments about faith, but you taught me that faith isn't about winning, it's about loving." When Ali passed away in 2016, Mitchell was one of the speakers at his memorial service. Standing before a crowd that included people of every race and religion, he told the story of how a letter written in hatred had been answered with love, and how that love had changed not just his own life, but the lives of everyone he touched. Muhammad Ali taught me that you can win in the ring, but not in faith, Mitchell said, his voice strong despite his advanced age. Faith isn't about defeating your enemies. It's about turning your enemies into friends. It's about loving people until they can't help but love you back. He paused, looking out at the diverse crowd gathered to honor Ali's memory. Muhammad Ali was the greatest boxer who ever lived. But more than that, he was the greatest teacher of faith I ever met. He taught me that God's love is bigger than our differences, stronger than our prejudices, and more powerful than our hatred. As Mitchell left the podium, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. It had started with a letter written in anger and ignorance, and it had led to a lifetime of learning what it really meant to love your enemies. In the end, Ali had been right. You could win in the ring, but not in faith. Faith wasn't about winning at all. It was about surrendering to love and letting that love transform not just yourself, but everyone whose life you touched. The letter that had started it all was now framed in Mitchell's home, a reminder of how far he had traveled from the man who had written those hateful words. Next to it hung a photograph of him and Ali, taken during one of their many conversations about faith and forgiveness. Looking at that photograph, Mitchell often marveled at the mysterious ways that God worked in the world. He had set out to wound Ali with his words, and instead, Ali had healed him with love. He had tried to prove Ali wrong about faith, and instead, Ali had taught him what faith really meant. It was, Mitchell often thought, the greatest victory of Muhammad Ali's career. Not because he had defeated an enemy, but because he had turned an enemy into a brother. And in doing so, he had shown the world what real faith looked like. If you made it this far and felt every word, won't you leave without subscribing? I tell these stories with my heart in my hands to reach people like you who feel, who get emotional, who live. If this truly touched you, give back, comment, subscribe. Come be part of this family with me until the next video.